Jingiwala. Hello. So we've just gone live. Hello. My name is Evelyn Araluen. I am coming to you here from my study / room in Woiwurrung Wurundjeri country in Kulin Nations. Before we do anything, it's really important that we take a moment to reflect on the places where we are coming to this conversation. This is unceded land. This is land which has always, since time immemorial and into perpetuity, has been protected and defended by the Kulin Nations. There's a very rich history that I myself am just learning about now as I've come to live in this place. I hope that wherever you are and wherever you're joining us from, that you are also able to reflect keenly on the history and the sovereignty of the place where you are living, and remind you that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and with Aboriginal land comes responsibilities to culture, responsibilities to its protectors, to the people who have cared for these places since time immemorial. So I hope that as we have this discussion, we proceed in the spirit of that respect and that honour for me to the Kulin Nations today. So, thank you for joining us on this Lunchtime Literature Writing Through Crisis stream as a part of the Emerging Writers Festival. You should be able to join us at any other time, whether or not you're eating lunch, entirely up to you. This event is a discussion of writing and literature and other forms of art and practice at a time of crisis, the idea of how we might write through and beyond potentially crisis, from a black summer, all summers are black for me, to a global pandemic, to the ongoing and necessary uprisings which we are currently in the midst of. 2020 has been a year that we won't ever forget, although at times we might have wanted to. For many, the feeling of living in crisis is not new, and many will continue to live in crisis long after the lockdowns are lifted. Today, I'm going to be having a conversation with two incredibly exciting emerging writers about crisis, about writing. First, Vanamali Hermans, who's a Wiradjuri Irish and Flemish woman. She's a disabled organiser and writer living in Canberra on Ngunnawal and Yambara land. She's an incredibly lovely writer, and we've got some work of hers appearing in Overland quite soon, which is very exciting. And then we are also joined by Julia Roseback, who's a queer Takatapui writer from Bulu, so-called Perth, based now in so-called Melbourne, Australia. Their writing focuses on trauma, connection, collective healing, and their experiences growing up with a chronic illness. Outside of writing, Julia is a facilitator, telephone support worker, and full-time student. Their other interests include reading memoirs, tending to their indoor plants, learning German, and raising their kitten, which is all incredibly important during a crisis. All of this is very crucial. I myself am a poet, I'm a researcher and a writer, as I've mentioned, currently based in the Kulin Nations, although I was born and raised on Darug country, and I am a descendant of the Bundjalung Nation. I work for Overland Literary Journal. I'm co-editor-in-chief there, which is a journal of progressive political publications that has an online magazine and a print journal that I'm very excited to be working on at the moment. I predominantly work around areas of Aboriginal women's writing, and I've got a book coming out with Queensland University of Queensland Press early next year. So with that spiel taken care of, please feel free to join us in this discussion on Twitter. You can send any questions, comments, criticisms, queries, just general existential comments using the hashtag on Twitter EWF20. Emerging Writers Festival staff are going to be monitoring that hashtag and sending questions through. I encourage you to do so. This is a really exciting conversation, and doing this digitally, it can sometimes feel a little bit alienated from our audience. So it'd be really lovely if you were able to use that hashtag so we could know that you were there and we could enjoy conversation with you. So, crisis. What is a crisis? As the event brief has kind of indicated, we are living in a situation of quite explicitly globally understood crisis that many people have been living in: personal, communal, socio-economic, political crises for a very long time. This country has been in a state of crisis since the first arrival of invaders, since the first settlement, and we have been defending our nations from the impact of crisis since this time. This country has had its fair share of ecological, political, socio-economic crises, and we are currently working through or attempting to create visibility around issues of prison abolition, of Aboriginal peoples, and solidarity for Black communities in the United States who are currently suffering exponentially from police violence. It's created an environment in which our politicians are getting pretty uncomfortable, as they should be. You guys are young people. You have inherited a world that doesn't understand you, and that I think you both keenly understand all too well for its flaws, and have both been working quite explicitly in visibility around those flaws and those problems and the particular oppressions in which people such as yourselves are entangled in and in defiance of. But this term crisis, how do you feel about it? I approach it with a bit of cynicism. As I said, one person's crisis might be the norm for an entire society. Crisis can be manufactured and mobilised and operationalised against oppressed peoples, and we seem to only care about it when it will make the news in such a way that inconveniences people's investment properties or something like that. But how do you as young people approach this term crisis, and does it feel like a term that you're comfortable with right now? We might start with you, Marley.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point. I think for a lot of our communities, we've been living in a state of perpetual crisis, like thinking of the bushfires, thinking of COVID-19, for instance, and thinking explicitly of like the disability community. Lockdown is not new to heaps of disabled and also other marginalized people, like we saw on Twitter heaps of people comparing lockdown to experiences of being incarcerated even. And yeah, it's just like these ways of living and restrictions on movement, restrictions on who gets to speak to what, have been how our communities have lived for a very, very, very long time. So I think, yeah, I am a big proponent of acknowledging that crisis is not just one event. It's often like sustained political structures, like colonialism is the crisis, white supremacy is the crisis, ableism is the crisis. It's not just COVID-19 or the bushfires in 2020 that are the crisis.
Yeah, amazing. That was a much more eloquent way of saying what I was stumbling around as I began with. So thank you so much for that, Marley. Julia, what are your thoughts?
The most recent piece of writing that I had published talked kind of specifically about this idea that, as Marley said, a lot of the restrictions that are in place now around COVID and around social distancing and social isolation are incredibly commonplace for chronically ill and disabled people. especially, you know, people who do have severely compromised immune systems likely do have to really consider the kind of spaces that they're entering and the kinds of precautions that they're taking to make sure that their health is okay. And that's always been the case. That's a crisis that a lot of us continuously live with. And it's both systemic in nature because we experience ableism, we experience sometimes really inadequate care from the health system, but it's also like a constant personal crisis in terms of both the specific ailments that you're struggling with, as well as any kind of emotional, mental reaction that you're going to have to the way that those things manifest. So the thing that I wrote about, because the thing that was really frustrating to me when we started talking about the COVID crisis, is this idea that able-bodied people or people who had no experience of sickness or no experience of disability, at least not personally, suddenly having this experience and suddenly feeling these limitations, then felt it fair to like define and label what we're going through now as a crisis and kind of completely ignore the experiences of everybody who came before. Because we do have a number of health crises, as I mentioned, as well as, you know, that there's a really significant increase in autoimmune disease that are occurring, and that in itself could be considered a crisis. But if it's not affecting the wider population, if it's not affecting rich people, if it's not affecting the stock market and like all these kinds of things, then it's not important enough to be speaking about and to be like having things in place to address it. So I definitely think there is a lot to be said about what kind of society the government defines as a crisis and what is actually realistic and what we're going through constantly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that speaks to a point about that I know that both of you raised when we were talking about this discussion prior. There's always this implication alongside, you know, who controls the narrative of what period are we going through a crisis? Is this a challenge? Is this an opportunity for us to all come together, depending on which email from which brand you open up, encouraging you to buy more linen or, you know, more loungewear right now. There is always this underlying implication about whose lives are valued most by capital and whose lives are seen as an imposition to capital. And it's, I imagine, for the both of you, probably quite disconcerting to the point of being, I would probably assume, quite traumatic to see the way in which a lot of the visibility that could be could be extended to people who have been suffering under exactly the same conditions of these kinds of restrictions of lockdown and quarantining. I imagine it's quite difficult to approach this with a sort of an empathy for people who are going through something that they have never gone through before, and an understanding that it can be challenging, alongside a sort of a recognition that this is a deeply problematic hierarchy of who controls the narrative of what is occurring right now, and who's being affected by it and who do we care about the ways in which it is affecting them. In these sorts of moments in time, we do often see quite volatile discourse rearing its head, of essentially about whose lives are valuable and whose lives are considered valuable under the conditions of capital. Molly, I know you've written quite a lot about ways in which different institutions have contributed to further harm being caused to vulnerable communities. Can you think a little bit about some of your own practice and writing more generally, and the possibility of that intervening, or do you think it's not yet at the stage of intervention and perhaps more at the stage of raising visibility?
That's a really good question. I think we are starting to get to the point of intervention. Like, I'm thinking particularly of the beginning of this year when so many examples, like disabled people seeing for the first time, able-bodied people, experiencing what it means to live in lockdown. And we're seeing the uprisings in the US, and, finally society is having a really big conversation about race. And even like at the start of the year with Job Seeker and, all of these people who might have called poor people dole bludgers beforehand are suddenly writing think pieces on what it means to live on welfare and things like that. And I think there are lots of writers from different marginalized communities who are like very strongly taking control of that narrative and are not allowing space for people who don't have authority to speak on things to continue speaking to things. Like, I'm thinking of Insiders, for example, how we continue to see panels of all white people talk on race and continue to talk on race, and how, communities are not letting that happen anymore. Thinking of my own experiences, I think intervention is possible, and we're getting to the point, but I think it is hard. And I think a lot of the time as writers, we're thrown into a kind of a place of reaction where we constantly have to react to other people who are controlling the narrative. And we have to, yet again assert that, hey, we already have a history of experiencing this. Hey, we already have histories of surviving this, for example, as well. And I think that takes its toll on people, and it can be really hard then to actually create writing and practice that is generative for us and that can be transformative as well. So I think it's hard. I think it's really hard. And I'm quite tired. Like, I have been completely overwhelmed by the last 6 months, and I have wanted in particular to write about grief because I've experienced a big loss in the past 10 months of my life. And living through COVID and everything else that's happening right now has kind of taken away my ability to think of the future a lot of the time. And that can be really challenging because, for me, I think writing is a really good tool to be able to let myself think of the future and to be able to keep going through all the different things that are happening in my life. Constantly being forced back into that place of reaction all the time. It's really tiring, really, really tiring.
Yeah, and it strikes me that like time is really what this very unequalizing effect of the narrative does take from people. Like it's taking from people the capacity to, as you say, like the capacity to do things such as grieve, forms of care that are incredibly important to different families, particularly, like as Aboriginal people, care is so crucial for us. Part of the ways in which we learn and we teach and we build our family bonds, and we are able to connect to the places that we come from and the people who came from there before us. But the imposition of not simply something like COVID-19, but also the work that that then requires of people who, yes, have had this experience, and yes, actually you're doing this all wrong, and I know you're doing this wrong because this has been my life for many years. It takes time away from people at a point in which their lives are already being deeply constrained by this necessity of producing for capital, and so it's quite. Myself, I see this as being something that is kind of not less necessarily a crisis in the sense that this is, so different and unexpected and chaotic. This to me seems like the culmination of a quite intentional of things, in which it exacerbates disadvantages for certain people at certain times, but it certainly doesn't equalize the experience for people. Julia, a lot of your work and your I feel like I can sort of see that your creative practice also does include a lot of visual aspects to it, and it's not simply writing and craft of writing. A lot of your work seems to be recently about this practice of awareness raising and drawing attention to that does very often seem to fall to already marginalized communities and already marginalized individuals, or people for whom these demands of time, these demands of capital, of labor, are already culturally, racially, socioeconomically, in a multitude of other ways affected and impacted. You're sort of coming into your practice as emerging as well, as we all kind of are. We're in this festival. How do you feel about some of the ways in which the work that you're producing at this particular time is defining that practice? Is it restraining it? Is it providing opportunity for you to think about the potentials of your work? Or do you feel that you're kind of answering to the expectations of this unequalizing system as it is flung at you?
I think going off what Marley was saying earlier about being tired, that really resonated, because I do think there is a kind of hypervigilance that you get into the habit of feeling when you're a part of a group of people that others typically speak for. And I feel like I'm constantly scanning social media and various publications to be like, what is the current narrative about these things? Who is going to be reading this? What are the beliefs that people are going to be taking from this information? And really wanting to make sure that it's not going to be done in a way that harms me, other marginalized people, communities and groups. And so I do think to some extent I feel pressure to correct misconceptions, or kind of provide a voice that people may not necessarily be wanting to hear or used to listening to about certain things. And I do think sometimes it gets in the way of the kind of writing that I would otherwise like to be doing, which is more about, I don't know, so many things, but not necessarily about, responding to a question that I never wanted to be answered, never wanted to be asked in the first place, or like responding to a topic that I don't think should have necessarily been raised. So when it comes to issues of like ableism, for example, and there's an ableist narrative that's being expressed, it does feel like there is some kind of pressure to then write a response to that, or include some kind of response to that in my writing. It feels as though I have some kind of responsibility to myself, my community, to be doing this, but it is really exhausting, and it does kind of feel more like a task than actually enjoyable writing in some ways. In other ways, it can be extremely enjoyable and cathartic, writing these kinds of things that are like actually pulling apart who's controlling the narrative and why and how they're able to do that. And I have gotten a lot of joy from doing that in the past, but I do think that I do wish in a lot of ways that it didn't feel necessary to constantly be really vigilant about what people are saying about me and people like me and people I care about.
That's been one of the most striking things, I think, about the particular ways in which like emerging writing communities are themselves emerging and kind of reformulating under different generational boundaries, and also I think quite different politics of exclusion. I certainly do know from my experience speaking with a lot of older people about the ways in which they emerged into writing spaces, particularly thinking about a lot of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, other Indigenous writers globally. You fought for every single inch, and we are ourselves in some way, beneficiaries of the work that has been previously done, but it should always operate in a structure of reciprocity. We should be, as we do this work because people who came before us facilitated this work, but we should then be looked after by the people who are next to come in that pattern of respect. It's quite daunting when you genuinely worry, like, will there be people coming after us who can inherit this work and can inherit these possibilities that we have been trying to create for them, when we are headed towards maybe the end of the world, hopefully the end of capitalism, but we'll see. So the craft and the practice of writing itself is kind of evolving, and we were talking before this discussion a little bit about perhaps an uneasiness around the terminology of writer. And I'm always suspicious of when young, particularly young, but any other emerging writer demonstrates that uneasiness with that terminology, because I think it goes into exactly the same thing you guys were both talking about, like who controls the narrative and who intentionally excludes people from the narrative. And why is it? It's just so funny that there are these particular patterns of who happens to always historically be excluded. So I love to see people owning this idea of being a writer. But would you mind talking through your relationship with that terminology a little bit? Do you have an uneasiness do you feel perhaps that you have your own definition of what being a writer might mean to you? And what does that look like for you, and what does that look like for your community? Marley, can you start with you?
Yeah. Yes, I really struggle to call myself a writer. And I think it's definitely because, my conventional understanding of a writer is often someone who is middle class, who is white, who is abled, who has probably studied writing at university or something like that. And so, to me, the forms of practice that I do, I write when I'm angry, or I write when I'm sad. I don't write with a particular practice in mind. I use it more as a tool, again, just to be able to express my own emotions and use my own voice. But even then, I struggle to conceive of my relationship to writing properly, because a lot of the time I'm not out here publishing in Overland, not publishing online. I'm writing Instagram posts, or, I'm writing mutual aid documents, or I'm scribbling away in my Google Drive and it will never see the light of day ever. And I feel like that kind of upsets the literary canon, what is considered writing and who is a writer. I would consider a lot of the people that I follow on Instagram, for instance, absolutely brilliant and beautiful writers who use that particular platform to convey really important and pressing messages. And I would do that just as well for people who are sitting there organizing and, writing big documents on all the different places you can contact in, COVID-19 and things like that. So I think that there definitely is a hesitancy within myself to call myself a writer. And I think it's because, my output is not what I associate with writing. And I know that is absolutely untrue. And I feel like I am starting to become a bit more comfortable and being like, yes, I'm a writer. But it's like who, comes back to that question on, I guess, continually not seeing people like yourself be writers, or continually seeing other people have the authority to speak on issues that are not theirs, or on communities that they don't belong to. And so, it can be hard then to value your own voice, I think.
Yeah, 100%. It's a question of representation. We've had this
this has popped up this week with the whole Josh Thomas gate or whatever they're going to call it. Endless conversation that we seem to be having about representation and this sort of assumed loop that nobody break. That how can we offer opportunities when these poor people just don't have enough training or experience compared to these otherwise incredibly experienced white people who were our mates that we just put on the show. And that's another very exhausting conversation, I feel, to constantly be caught up in the function of writing for many marginalised communities is less about being able to produce work. And Julia, you briefly mentioned, there's other things you'd love to be writing about. And like, same here. I imagine, one day I'm going to, run a journal just based off of like letting people who are constantly pigeonholed into having to write sort of, representational pieces, just write whatever the hell they want to write under no forced constraints. But it's very frustrating because I think the creative limitations that are imposed upon marginalised people to correct representations that were not, or a lack of representation that was not the fault of those communities is an enormous burden. And I find it, myself deeply exhausting, and I've been able to kind of find my own niche in that. So, that's something that I hope that you guys are both able to bring into your practice. Julia, same sort of question to you. How do you feel like you are defining or redefining writer for yourself, and how do you feel about some of the legacies of that category? Does it impose on you? Do you feel like you can identify with it? Do you feel like there's a possibility for you to undermine or play or challenge that in your own craft?
It's interesting because when I was a child, I was really into writing and I really wanted to be a writer. And I would always say to people when they asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I want to be a writer. But when I think back on it at the time, I already was writing so much. I was spending the vast majority of my time writing like murder mysteries based off like R.L. Stein books that I thought were incredible. But regardless, I was just like dedicating my time to doing that. And so it's interesting thinking about why I wouldn't have categorized myself as a writer at that point, when that's probably the time in my life when I was writing the most. And I think a lot of it comes down to this like feeling that if you're not actually showing people you're writing and producing things that are like tangible and able to be read, then you're not yet a writer. And it's only once you've actually put something out there that other people can read and analyze and reflect on that, that only at that point should you consider yourself a writer. But it's like such a kind of internalized capitalistic idea that the only way that you can be something or identify within something or define yourself as something is like reliant on your ability to produce. And I think for me, I'm happy to call myself a writer like right after I published something. But if I haven't in a while, then I'm not going to, even if I'm still writing during that period of time. And that whole idea kind of came to me first when a really good friend of mine who's been writing a novel for years and has like virtually finished this thing, like is just going through the editing process, has studied editing, has studied writing, even now it's like, I'm kind of a writer. And it's like, other than the fact that what you have written hasn't been published and other people haven't read it, you are 100% a writer. Like that is 100% what being a writer entails, is writing and like dedicating yourself to the craft of writing, however much that is, like however much time you actually spend doing that.
It's so frustrating that this idea of being a writer is really unfortunately restrained by the notion of like how much capital you produce, when writing is for the hours that you spend on it, horrendously underfunded. I think the sort of the estimation or the average of a writer's income in Australia, Macquarie University did a study about this a couple of years ago. It was like $12,000 per year as an income. So the possibility of being a full-time writer for money is incredibly limited and inaccessible. And so I'm like, yeah, free up that term, because that terminology really only works for like a very small handful of people. And again, there's always going to be patterns of who has access to that. No one really can afford to fund a writing career purely on writing itself. There's other forms of work and labour which will always go into sustaining that. So it's a ridiculous restriction based on the term by capital as opposed to by practice. And I hope that the Emerging Writers Festival, sort of for people coming into this space, is an important revelation of that fact for people who, you know, maybe aspire to this terminology, but also like have felt discomfort towards it, you know, as we all in this little black box have. With that discussion of writing and your craft and how you're defining your craft, would you guys like to read some of your work? Marley, would you be interested in us starting with you?
Yes, sure. I might actually read a poem. So I have never published poetry before, ever. This is a bit of a new thing for me. I'm usually a little bit of an opinion piece girl, always in reaction to things. But yeah, so this is a poem I wrote around 2.5 months ago, and it's just about my experiences caring for my mum within the medical industrial complex, and it is called A Haunting on the Ward. Antiseptic rips nose, hangs heavy on the senses. Bottles of it, marker of passage, movement, boundary, cling to me like smoke. Sterile corridors are littered with us, behind curtains and chart, held down by bleached linen many hands have toiled at. The oppressed are sick people, not in soul or in spirit, but in heart and lung and mind and every other bit of body they've taken from us too. Here, death is armed with paper and jargon, with a million different words that all end up meaning you ain't human enough for us. Outside nurse become warden, become master, surveil and swarm beds, whisper secrets and write code. I think these wards are haunted, mama, the way this place holds pain. There ain't much healing to be done when you can't get away from them ghosts.
That's so beautiful, Marley. See, and you're a poet. That's, even if you haven't published it, you're a poet. That's really beautiful. Thank you very much for sharing that experience. How was writing poetry for you when you first sort of came into it? I found it terrifying and was so unwilling to show any of my work when I began writing poetry, which I began writing like in a TAFE class to learn my great grandfather's language. What was your experience with coming to poetry as a form?
I think it was just, I tend to write in bursts when I'm feeling very intensely an emotion, right? And often I just don't have the energy, I don't have the attention to sit down and write a long essay on it. So I feel like poetry is quite accessible and it allows me to convey or write that emotion in a kind of, I guess a condensed way. But I still very much struggle with like the conventions of poetry, like grammar and punctuation and line breaks. Don't really understand any of it. So it's kind of like putting
since like maybe T.S. Eliot, maybe since then. Yeah, so don't worry about them.
I won't. But I find it quite accessible.
Amazing. And that's another really important point, I think, like just acknowledging that all form has a function. I get so upset when like things like slam and performance poetry get dismissed as not being sort of real creative practice, and it's just like, oh, it's because it's not for you, or it's because it's adapted to it comes from particular contexts and works in particular contexts that are not the conventional academic literary space, and that doesn't devalue them in any way that you would say that a children's book is not a book just because it's meant for children. Like, okay, cool, form and function, that's pretty basic conversation, guys. Let's like get with the times. But no, we're not allowed to like things that are predominantly performed or worked in by people of color or marginalized peoples. That's the secret. So thank you so much for sharing that. Julia, would you like to share some of your work with us?
Sure. Marley, that was so beautiful. I started tearing up, and I feel a little bit emotional generally now, so we'll see how this reading goes. This is just a short part of an article that I wrote for Overland last year. We make small movements toward a future where care is expected and provided, not earned. We continue the taboo anti-capitalist tradition of caring for other people and build networks around our isolation. We uphold each other's art, music, poems, and passions. We applaud one another's efforts and achievements. We hold space for each other's pain. We show up. In the words of Johanna Hedvar, we prioritize the care and love of our sick, pained, expensive, sensitive, fantastic bodies. So in the end, when capitalism, the state, and the medical industrial complex burns and expects us to burn with it, we'll pull out the buckets of water we've hidden in our wheelchairs, neck braces, hospital beds, compression socks, pill organisers, and rollators, and we'll put out each other's flames.
Not only do I really love that, there's also a very particular, special, sort of bizarre connection I have to that. You published that piece on the very first day I started working for Overland.
Really?
Yeah. So I got to like look at comments coming through from people, which was a lovely experience, because comment sections on writing, particularly for marginalised pieces, are incredibly volatile spaces. They're spaces that are just filled with hatred, but your piece just got so much joyous thanks from your audience of people who just were so happy, I think, to feel seen and articulated about such a kind of important and tender, I think deeply tender topic, I think was the way that piece comes across. And we will share that piece through the Emerging Writers Festival Twitter afterwards. So if anyone would like to read a little bit more about that, and I'm sure we can share Marley's poem when it is eventually published. I think I know who wants it. So do you want to just, before we go to audience questions, do you want to share a little bit about some of your practice in terms of how you have particularly come to this? So this is what I think we kind of would call this sort of like a kind of a memoir style of work, like a memoir essay that is becoming, I think, an increasingly popular form. How do you feel about this particular form and how you've kind of been working in it or making it your own?
I absolutely adore memoir as a practice in writing. It's my favorite thing to read, and I don't necessarily mean memoirs from people who have achieved these really incredible things and are talking about their life in this regard, but memoirs from people who are otherwise living relatively ordinary lives but have so much to say and have such depth and tenderness and emotion behind their words that you just want to hear so much about their life and their experiences. And so that is my favorite kind of writing to engage with. And for me, I guess, having grown up with a lot of mental illness and a lot of having to engage with those kind of shadow parts of myself that I've been ashamed of for quite a long time, writing memoir, whether it's with the intention to be published or just for my own benefit, feels kind of like reclaiming those parts of myself that I don't necessarily feel proud of, or that I don't necessarily like acknowledging, and shaping them in a way that feels cathartic, and could, if someone does eventually read it, could benefit them too. I think I have a lot to say about a lot of different things. And yeah, a big part of why I got into that was just being forced to reflect so heavily on my own thoughts and emotions and behaviors for a lot of my life, and now wanting to write about those and write about what I've learned from them, and reflections that I might have. And also just some pretty interesting things have happened to me throughout my life that I like kind of spinning into a juicy story. I think that is also kind of cathartic to do, to take something that otherwise is maybe a bit traumatic and to make it like a little bit comical, but still a little bit vulnerable. And yeah, I think there's something really special in being able to do that with your own narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by a point that I'm pretty sure I saw it on like Instagram or something like that. That you know, someone had made, that was just essentially that you can be vulnerable about anything. Sometimes people will be upfront and very explicit on topics that are perceived to be vulnerable, but it might not necessarily be vulnerable for them. And vulnerability as a way of articulating what might be your ordinary everyday, I think is it's at times like a burden that's very often placed on marginalized identities for the purpose of representation. But I do also feel like it is one that when we have these like really, you know, positive, generative dialogues between the communities of who is the reader, who is the writer, who is the producer, and who is in some way like witness to that. It's really beautiful, I think, when vulnerability can enter into something that helps other people be seen by that work. We've got a couple of questions from our audience, and just a reminder for those of you watching that you can ask questions to the hashtag EWF20 on Twitter. I'm not sure if you can ask questions without Twitter, but maybe that's an incitement for you to get Twitter and join the rest of us degenerates. So the first question: often during a crisis, I feel both an urgency to write, but also an inability to write or be creative, which is frustrating. Do you have any advice on navigating, I guess, the emotional toll that a crisis can take on creativity? Marley, we might want to start with you with that one.
Yeah, I find that so relatable. Hey, I find the urgency quite paralyzing. Like, I'm like, oh my goodness, I just feel like, Julia, I think you spoke about this before really beautifully. Like, you feel this responsibility to respond a lot of the time, and it's paralyzing. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't do it. And then I sit for days and I just kind of construct in my head, what is the type of piece that I would write to respond to? And then I often don't end up doing it at all. Like, I just do it as an exercise in my own head. So I think breaking through that, I am a big proponent of my Google Drive. I have a folder called Writing, and I just have like Google Docs, and I write in bullet point form a lot of the time, and I write the types of ideas or thoughts that come in, and often I will not end up writing the piece, right? But when I do have time, or I feel like I have capacity, I sit down, and often I just cherry pick from all these different bullet points and documents, and then I can create something that I'm kind of happy with. But yeah, the emotional toll on writing is really challenging. And I think too, something that I have not worked through yet and I'm still swept up in is, what is the emotional response I think people are expecting from me compared to what is the actual emotional response I'm having. And I think in periods of really deep crisis, there's a pressure to respond in a way that people perceive you're going to respond. And it comes into the conversation about vulnerability as well. And I think challenging that is really important. And letting ourselves take time to rest too, and not always have to constantly respond as well. But yeah.
No, that's a really important answer because it has many practical tips, and I also agree with that sort of self-documentation practice. You know, I've always got notes open on my phone to make an observation or a comment, but also just the emotional allowance that you do have to extend yourself. You know, like let yourself feel everything, let yourself feel it. But recognize that that is itself a kind of labor that you are investing back into your environment. And sometimes that's enough. Julia, what are your thoughts on that question?
Extremely similar. Like everything that you said really resonated. Same. I think that a lot of the time you're going to have an emotional response to a situation or a crisis, and you won't necessarily be able to put that into words anytime soon. Like you may just have to kind of sit with those emotions and let them crash over you before you're able to access like thoughts that are attached to them, and then those thoughts can be put into writing at a later time if you have the energy to do that. But yeah, I completely agree that a lot of it is just like writing down the things that you're feeling, the things that you're thinking, not censoring yourself in any way to just really try and break down what your response is to this thing. And then later you can kind of like move things around and structure them in a way that maybe makes sense to you and you think will make sense to other people. But yeah, a big part of writing about anything that's traumatic or has any kind of like emotional response for you is just being a little bit patient, as hard as that often feels, because you're like, I need people to know how I feel about this right now. But yeah, it definitely does take time and consideration.
Yeah, I mean, stepping into that very briefly as a creative writing teacher, I found that, you know, like I've got work that I'm supposed to be doing right now, commenting on a lot of different things and writing different pieces. And you know, as an editor, we get sent, you know, several pieces a day of people responding to the immediacy of what's going on. And I find that, you know, I really get drawn into looking for work which doesn't feel motivated to answer for everything, doesn't feel motivated to organize what's happening into any perceivable logic, because we're never going to be able to do that. Myself, like I don't want to write endless response and endless feedback loops right now. Like I'm like intentionally giving myself time to work on projects that I'm never gonna I'm never gonna like publish any of this stuff. But like sometimes I just like writing stuff that I can go back and read for myself, and I enjoy it. And that's something that, you know, is like not necessarily a productive investment of my writing, but I like it. You know, I like to be able to reread what I've written and enjoy it later on. And perhaps, you know, the writing you do right now might be a kindness to your future self. Another thing though, just as a creative writing teacher, write if you feel like you need to write. You're one of the people who needs to write in order to understand what's happening to you, like in order to kind of process, and writing is a part of your reflective process. Write about what is happening to a character, and that character might be you, you know, like sort of in a third person externalized, but, you know, just write about that and allow yourself the potential distance that might come from, yes, a character representation, but also might come from the kindness of, say, like a friend trying to extend the same sympathies and generosity that you would extend to somebody else in your situation. Don't feel compelled to immediately respond. That's reaction in writing is, of course, crucial, but not always, you know, not always the most generative force there. Another question that we've got is, how do you see the role of imagination in your work? And I think that's actually a really interesting question to be asking right now, when perhaps we might want to be imagining slightly altered realities. Marley, can we start with you on that one?
Yeah. I want to like link that question back to the last one, actually, because Julia, I was thinking when you said sometimes it's best to just sit on work, I think that's really important. Like I had like a compulsion when COVID started happening, I wanted to write on my own experiences of grief during the pandemic and how the pandemic had kind of altered the way that I was thinking about the future, and it had taken away my normal, trajectory of grief I would have had access to. And I wanted to write that I can't think of the future anymore. But then suddenly there was this huge uprising in the US, and we're living in a very pertinent political moment, and suddenly abolition is forefront and center. And I'm like, wow, I can suddenly think of the future again. I can think of and imagine all of these different ways of being and responding to situations. So I think the writing I enjoy most invokes imagination, because Evelyn, like you said, there is this trend to just have to constantly categorize and fit everything that's going on to a really neat puzzle or the right take of whatever's happening. And that comes at the expense of actually imagining what are the worlds that we want to live in, what are the different types of writing we want to be able to read. So I think imagination in writing is something that I love the most, but I feel like I have the least access to. I feel I have the least time to actually properly invest in, because I think it is the hardest thing to invest in, because we are always, being told to react to this or and how to incorporate imagination in writing. I'm not quite sure. I think I struggle with creative writing a lot. I would consider myself not a creative person. I wrote a short story for the first time recently, just because I was feeling quite sad and I wanted to rewrite a period of my life that made me really happy. And that was a really cathartic experience, just to be able to kind of recount the sensory experiences I'd had in this moment. So yeah, I think imagination is really important, and it allows us to play with form a bit as well.
That's really beautiful, though, because that's kind of a way of giving back yourself. We were talking about time, before, and what time crises takes from us in the way of time, and particularly, the people who are already sort of viewed as being an inconvenience to but that's kind of giving a gift of kind of reimagining that time back to yourself, healing even some of those experiences, which is a really beautiful way of thinking of it. Julia, last words go to you on this question, because we're going to have to wrap up in a minute or two.
As I mentioned earlier, writing was a massive part of my childhood, and it was always creative writing. I loved creating stories and universes that were quite different to the ones that I was living in. As a bit of a potentially TMI tangent, I got into creative writing because I was diagnosed with a gastrointestinal disorder when I was really young, and I used to have to spend hours at a time in the bathroom, because it got to a point where it was kind of there's no point leaving if I'm just going to be back there again in 15 minutes. So I used to just sit there and create stories and create these characters and kind of have this narrative going on in my head of this person's talking to this person now and this person's done this. And that was so enjoyable for me, and such an incredible way to distance myself from the distress that I otherwise may have been feeling being quite sick. And then it reached a point where I was no, if I'm going to be producing writing, I need to be talking about real things, and I need to be unpacking these really important topical things. And so my writing just became about essays and memoir and things like this. And only recently, I've been reading a lot of Octavia Butler, who has really helped me kind of find the balance between those two things, talking about topics that are incredibly important, but also including fantasy and sci-fi and imagination in that work, and creating these universes that include various forms of oppression and various forms of harm, but are still not the universe we're currently living in, or an over-exaggerated version of this universe, or something like this. And yeah, so I guess to answer the question, I'm currently at a kind of crossroads where I'm trying to incorporate more creativity and imagination into my writing and trying to go back a little bit to creative writing while still talking about issues that I think are really important to include in that.
Beautiful. Well, thank you to both so much for all of your insights today. That was a really lovely conversation, and it's very lovely to talk to the both of you. You're both incredibly talented and insightful people, and it's a very heartening experience for me. So thank you both very much for that. I urge all listeners to keep abreast of Julia and Marley's work, following what they're doing. Hopefully more overland stuff. And a big thank you to the Emerging Writers Festival. It's really important work, I think, platforming people who are entering into these literary spaces. So please check out the Emerging Writers Festival website to look at the rest of the program and make sure that you are keeping up with some of the talks that you might have missed on their YouTube and website. So a big thank you. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, or whatever time of the 24-hour cycle you might be joining this on. So thank you, and everybody take care in this crazy crisis time. Bye.
Bye.